train. So before I begin, I have to thank Dr. Chappell for first letting me into this program and funding all the electronics that it required. And I wanted to thank Ati for his work all last year on the WebEx to get me online, and Allison and Kija this year for helping me again on the WebEx, and Dr. Ana Fuentes for adjusting the teaching so that I could have a full experience, because without their help it would not have happened. And then I have to thank my husband, without whom nothing happens. So my paper came out of an event a couple years ago when my Iraqi friend, she called me and she said, Eva, I have some kefir for you. And I said, I don't know what that is. And she said, just Google it. Well, kefir is a dairy probiotic that you use to ferment milk. And it's been something that people have used over hundreds, if not thousands of years. And little did I know that that jar of milk filled with a couple tablespoons of kefir grains was going to open a door to health, but also bacteria. And when I learned about the kefir and started using it, I started teaching a class I called the Yoga of Food. And when I was doing the research for that class, I learned many, many interesting things about bacteria. So next slide. So one of the things that I learned is that humans have come from bacteria, and that research has come out of the Human Genome Project, which they just finished in 2003, mapping out the entire human genome. And what they discovered was that at our core, we are bacteria. So the next slide, please. So as a result, they have reorganized the entire evolutionary tree into a circular model, which I think looks a bit like a mandala. And at the center sits the cosmic bindu, because bacteria has been found to be the basis for all life, plants, animals, and fungi on Earth. And I found this to be very interesting when we got into our class with Sri Aurobindo and talking about Sri Aurobindo and the mother and integral yoga in modern yoga class, because they said that humans are not at the pinnacle of evolution, that in fact we have a next level to go to, towards a Superman. And in that journey though, in the evolution, it requires a cooperation between the higher realms and the lower realms coming together through the mother. And in that integral yoga, the importance is to bring the divine down into the cells, into a cellular level. And they talked about the cells having a consciousness, and actually a kind of consciousness of catastrophe and worry. So based upon my understanding of bacteria, I said, well, this is very interesting. I wonder if they're talking about bacteria. And I needed to look into a little bit more research on how science is looking at evolution today. Now, just a quick note, all of this blue here is bacterial life. This is plant life, these are eukaryotes, humans are right here. So most life is bacterial. So the next slide. So in learning about the evolution on Earth today, I discovered that it's no longer the Darwinian survival of the fittest type of a model. And that evolution is based upon serial endosymbiosis theory, which was brought to the public eye, I guess, or put into science journals in 1967 by the brilliant geoscientist Dr. Lynn Margulis. Now this model I found on the internet. This is done by 9th graders today. This is all new for Eva, but 9th graders know this. So she put together her theory in 1967, and she said human beings did not come, and life did not come from a survival of the fittest. Instead, it's a cooperative model where different organisms come together, they learn to cooperate, and they become mutually beneficial, and a new being is created. All right? So cooperation is the key. Let's go to the next slide. And actually, let's go back one slide again. So life on Earth started about 3.5 billion years ago, and it began with the bacteria, according to Margulis. And bacteria have dominated life. There was only bacteria for almost 2 billion years. And since then, bacteria still continues to be the dominant kingdom on the planet. Humans are, there's a tiny little bit right here if you narrow down it, but it's mostly a bacterial life. The next slide. Thank you. I'm paraphrasing Dr. Lynn Margulis.
Who has spoken here at LMU.
Okay, she just passed away in 2011, so I'm sure it was a very interesting talk, yes. Yeah. And what she said was that in the beginning, there was nothing on Earth, and there was no oxygen on Earth. And there were 4 elemental bacteria. One of them, the cyanobacteria, it was able to ingest sunlight and carbon dioxide, make that into energy, and breathe out oxygen. So over a couple billion years, the bacteria built up the oxygen layer within the Earth. There was also these spirochetes, which were very mobile, but they were anaerobic, meaning they could not breathe oxygen. There was the thermoplast, which lived in very hot, hundreds of degrees, and very acidic environments. They fermented their energy, and that's where kefir came from billions of years later. And the paracocci, which over time developed the ability to breathe oxygen, so they're a later component, or a later addition. But over time, all these bacteria moved together, they combined, and they created the plant, animal, and fungi life of all life here on Earth. So the next slide. So when I read about those bacteria, I said, it sounds very much to me like the Mahabhutas of the Samkhya Tattva map. The spirochetes, the anaerobic, reminded me of water because they were mobile. The thermoplasts reminded me of fire because they lived in the hot areas. The paracocci were in the air, and the cyanobacteria because they created oxygen, which led to plants, and I looked at that as being the earth. So the elemental bacteria, I think, match up to the Samkhya map. Now, the one area that was missing was space. And Lynn Margulis said that, well, before bacteria there was nothing. Okay, so that could be space. But the scientists today, there's a theory that bacteria actually came from outer space, and that it landed on Earth and seeded the Earth. So it could be outer space. But space could also, based upon my research, be the space between the bacteria, that they had to communicate with each other in order to come together in this cooperative relationship. So they had to bridge the space between them. All right, next slide, please. And what we find out today is that bacteria actually communicate. That's the quorum sensing theory. So about 10 years ago, this brilliant molecular biologist, Dr. Bonnie Bassler out of Princeton, she discovered that bacteria talk. And they communicate with each other in a chemical language. And it's called quorum sensing. So when bacteria meet, well, first of all, bacteria, they all are bilingual. They speak the language of their own species, but there's also a bacterial language called Bacteria Esperanza, or that's what the scientists call it. So when bacteria come together, the first thing they do is they exchange information on how they each survived in their particular environment. They share DNA so that they can each learn to survive better in the environment. And with that communication, they began to build cities, which we call biofilms. And in those cities, they distribute food, they have electricity, they build communities, they act together defensively and offensively against other bad bacteria, and like the Tudors, when they have rival bacteria come into their kingdom, they send out misinformation so they go off track and they don't really understand what's happening in that particular kingdom. So bacteria are very social, and when they come together, they go from a single cellular organism into a multicellular organism. And they do that by voting. When they get enough of a quorum, the bacteria act together. But singly, a bacteria cannot do much alone. All right, so they're very amazing in that way. So literally within us, there is a universe of bacteria that are communicating and living and have a consciousness that we have been unaware of. So Aurobindo and Alfasa had said that humanity has not yet reached the pinnacle of their evolution. and that in order to progress, we must bring the divine consciousness down into our cells. So when I read that, I said, I wonder if they're talking about bacteria. And reading Aurobindo, which is not an easy task, they talk about the cells and they talk about microbes, which microbes, they were aware of microbes being around us, but they didn't seem to be talking about bacteria. So to me, what is revolutionary between the science, this intersection between Aurobindo and molecular biology, is that they both say we're not simply a human body, that beyond our body there's another mind in the body, and that Aurobindo said that that mind was in our cells. I'm suggesting there's another mind or consciousness within the bacteria. Next slide, please. This is the model of the body based upon Aurobindo's writing. You will see that they have the links to the Danta. And traditionally in yoga, described the body as having the 5 koshas. And the outer kosha, the Annamaya kosha, was the physical body. And the physical body was what we had to ready through pranayama, asana, and diet so that we could steady our mind, calm the mind, and go to liberation by exiting the body. All right, the difference is Aurobindo says that for us to evolve, we can stay in the body, and that our transformation would result us being immortal while in the body. Aurobindo, don't change it yet. Aurobindo talked about every relationship in the universe being a biune relationship. That means 2 opposite aspects seem to be unrelated, but actually they are related as one. So biune relationship. And he says recognizing these biune relationships is essentially what makes us whole. So to me, based upon what science is saying, the Annamaya kosha is actually a biune relationship between human and bacteria cells. All right? And the quorum sensing demonstrate that the bacteria have a level of consciousness. Therefore, in order for us to evolve, we must not only work with our own cellular consciousness, but we must work with the bacterial consciousness. So we need to let our human cells know that we want to transform, as well as our bacterial cells. Now, Aurobindo said in order to do this work, we must surrender to the mother. And he described the body by using the traditional names, the Annamaya, but he added on Purusha, because the Purusha is the consciousness that occupies that particular layer. But if there's a Purusha, there must also be a property in all these relationships. So now the next. And that brings us back to the science. Here's mitochondria. So within every cell, we have a cell and it has its DNA. And within all plant, fungi, and animal cells, there's a separate, smaller organelle. It's called a mitochondria. It has its own membrane, and it also has its own DNA. And the mitochondria are very interesting because they perform very important functions. One is they give energy to the cell. They provide ATP. The second thing that mitochondria do is that they determine what the cell is going to become. So the cell's DNA is loaded with potential, but it's the mitochondria that communicates with the cell and tells it what it's going to become. It tells the cell when it's going to live, and it tells the cell when it's going to die. The mitochondria also are only passed through the mother's DNA. It's a maternal line. And when, in humans, when the egg and the sperm come together, the male mitochondria drops off, and we're left with the female mitochondria only. And that mitochondria is so stable, it does not mutate very often, that the geneticists have been able to trace back through the female line to the beginning mitochondrial Eves. And that is all through the feminine line. The other thing about mitochondria is that they respire. They breathe air. They use the prana. So what was very interesting about what Lynn Margulis said is she said the first cells, the first spirochetes, which moved through the water and were very mobile, looked very similar to the mitochondria. And in fact, the mitochondria may have been originally free-living bacteria. But when they came together, the mitochondria, and she described them as being coiled like snakes. And when the mitochondria act and they release their energy, that energy for a nanosecond is the same as a bolt of lightning. Boom. Right? So if you talk about this, and I listened and I said, that to me sounds like the Kundalini. Right? So within all of our cells, and it makes sense, we have both the Purusha, the consciousness, the potentiality, as well as the Prakriti, the Kundalini, the feminine aspect, which energizes those very cells. And Aurobindo says that it's through the mother, through Prakriti, that all life is formed and transformed, and suggests that it's Prakriti that manifests within us. And I suggest that it's Prakriti manifesting as the mitochondria within us that energizes and helps every cell transform. So that's my case in a nutshell. Next slide. This is the very last slide. This is just to show you, it was published on April 11th, like the day after I finished my paper. And this is the most recent mapping of bacteria that was released. And so all it shows is that it's continuing, the work is continuing on, it's in its infancy. But this particular tree, again, dominated by bacteria, here's the eukaryotes, we're just humans, and it looks a little bit similar to Darwin's tree of life. But I had to put that in there because that's the most recent tree of life. Yes.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
What?
I don't know your name.
My first name is Morgan.
Morgan. Yes, ma'am.
Morgan Morrison. Let's go back to your first assertion.
Okay.
Where you say serial endosymbiosis
Yes.
is the living in one organism of another one.
Correct.
If we can construe that,
Right.
and then you reference a different area of bacteriology. I think I've forgotten. Well, it's been a while since I've heard Bonnie. I think this person is Bonnie.
Bonnie Bassler.
Yeah, the Princeton.
Right.
I've heard her talk.
Right. She's
on two
brilliant.
different occasions. And what happens in quorum sensing theory, which is true of many different species of asocial and social animals, is that they develop a critical mass.
Correct.
And the language, in air quotes, that they speak to each other is of two types, not the type you reference. Because, first of all, the bacteria of the same kind speak to each other in one language.
Correct.
And then the different species in the gut speak different kinds of
Languages.
but they're mutually exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's what they said. There's
one-
two language, bilingual.
one area, well, they're not really, it's more of it's not a symbiotic relationship.
Mm.
Because one of the areas that they're working on right now is creating classes of antibiotics where bacteria lose their ability to quorum sense. In
Right.
other words, they can't count anymore,
Right.
which is their language. And in terms of the treatment that the mitochondria is, I think you have two different systems of reasoning work here. One is the system that Aurobindo wrote about. It's reasoning by analogy.
Mm.
This is what something is like, but it doesn't provide what something, the type of reasoning where in the West we reason by abstraction. We don't know actually what the mitochondria does other than it's a metabolic furnace. But we don't know how it came into existence or what its many other properties are. So I think to say that this is the intersection of yoga, which is based on reasoning by analogy, and a modern science, two different areas of bacteriology, I think they're quite different and quite discrete from one another. And I don't think that, other than to say, I can give the terms in bacteriology a treatment and give them a Sanskrit, if you will, veneer, I don't think that system holds up very well. Because the basic assumption is that if we're reasoning by analogy, we can't be reasoning by abstraction at the same time.
I understand. I mean, to me, this is an attempt as a modern yogi and as a non-scientific person to see how modern science and traditional yoga practices, but I was looking at Aurobindo, which is considered modern yoga, but how they mesh together. And over time, we'll see what the results are of the science, because the science is still in its infancy. But I guess my premise is that there are some very interesting observations made out of Indian philosophy, and that have been built into Samkhya, the Vedanta, and we're starting to see some of that perhaps show up in the science. And when I look at, I really appreciated Aurobindo's view on yoga, and when I look at how he was melding the science of his time and philosophy and the traditions together, he was also saying, look, as we evolve, we have to take a look at ourselves. And that was quite unique within the yoga traditions. So what I'm saying is that, the scientists are also saying we are more than just this body, that we have cells too. We have these bacteria in us. So I see there's some similarities there. Now, is it one-on-one? No. I mean, we're in the beginning of a huge new study. And I'm just hoping that perhaps it gives a glimpse of perhaps where those intersections are, and they can be maybe validated, maybe not by science later. But I do think modern yoga does that.
Well, one thing you might want to do is, one of the translations of yoga is discipline.
I'm sorry, but time is
Okay.
really upon us.
Yeah.
You're welcome to keep the conversation after this. Thank you very much for all of you. We'll be here back on Wednesday.
Oh, yeah.